So I was out cruising the internet one day and stumbled upon this website called the Corporation, and I'm sort of familiar with this website because it's a place where you can order certain teaching materials, particularly wet specimens or preserved specimens of certain organisms to study the biology of them, whether it's physiology, comparative animal physiology, human physiology. You could order stuff like sheep eyes, cow eyes, pig hearts, and fetal pigs and stuff like that. It's all for teaching purposes and everything. So I went online and I found out that they have this thing right here, this horseshoe crab. And I wanted to order the 8-inch horseshoe crab for 10 bucks. 8-inch horseshoe crab for 10 bucks seemed like a pretty good deal. Turned out like, it was on back order. So there was the delay in shipping it. I had to wait like about a month in order to get it. But when they finally sent it to me, this is what they sent me right here. This obviously ain't no 8-inch horseshoe crab. It's more like an 18-inch horseshoe crab. So yeah, I'm a little excited about this. So let's get into it. Let's do a little unpackaging. Well, it's got some weight to it. It's pretty hefty. So what I'm gonna do when I'm done talking about this is I'm actually gonna let it sit outside and dry out, and I'm gonna preserve it somewhere in my house, and hopefully use it for future presentations. Take it open. Ooh, you can see the Telson right there. So I'm gonna try to be very careful. Pull it out. I think we're halfway done. Soggy cardboard here. I'm just gonna rip it apart. Trying to be careful not breaking anything, but I'm so excited to get the look at there she is. Alright, that should make it easier. Ooh, wow. Oh, there's a little piece broken off. I wonder where that came from. Put that over there for a sec. Oh wow, this is straight massive. This is not an 8-inch horseshoe crab. Oh, and there it is. Let me clean up my workspace real quick. All right, that's better. All right, so what we have in front of us is a preserved specimen of Limulus polyphemus, aka the Atlantic horseshoe crab. Now, the reason why I ordered one of these is because I live out here on the West Coast, and these are actually not native out here on the West Coast. It's an eastern species, and with me just having a entomology background, these kind of hold near and dear to my heart as far as the evolution of arthropods go. And this species, or this group of organisms right here, are what's known commonly by a lot of folks as living fossils, although I kind of have a problem with that term because fossils are obviously dead, and this thing is obviously extinct. And the fossils of creatures that have similar morphologies to this aren't the exact same species as this. It's not like these have never changed since hundreds of millions of years ago. They have obviously changed to cope and adapt to the current conditions on Earth. But nonetheless, the morphology and the phenotypes of this certain group of organisms has remained pretty stubborn over hundreds of millions of years. I mean, it's kind of a misnomer of it being named horseshoe crab. I could see why people who didn't know any better would call it a crab because, it kind of looks most similar to a crab than anything else. However, it is not related to crabs or any type of crustacean at all. It is an arthropod, but it's in its own group. It's a part of a very ancient lineage, again, a very ancient stubborn phenotype lineage that goes back hundreds of millions of years. In a group that is now called the Xiphosura. And Xiphosura, I think, pretty much translates to like sword tails or something like that, sword tail arthropods, because of this Telson segment right here, which I guess is reminiscent of some sort of sword structure. So these are actually more closely related to spiders and scorpions than they would be related to actual crabs, the predecessors to the arachnids right here. So what I'm going to talk about today is basically the morphological similarities between these Xiphosurans, these horseshoe crabs, and you know, our modern living arachnids, spiders and scorpions and the like. And one of the main similarities between those two groups are basically the number of body regions. So spiders and scorpions, arachnids, plus Xiphosurians have two main body regions. They have the anterior portion known as the prosoma, and then you have the posterior portion right here known as the opisthosoma. And within the opisthosoma is where a lot of the other bodily physiological functions will occur, such as digestion, circulation, and respiration, gas exchange, and the like. So looking at the front here, I remember when I was younger and I would see these things on TV, I'm like, where are the eyes? Where are the eyes? And as I got older and more astute and started looking at it, I found out that these are the eyes right here. And you know, I knew that these things were related to arachnids more than they were insects, but I was always confused because they had compound eyes. Now, if you know anything about arachnids, arachnids don't really have compound eyes. They have simple eyes, or what's known as simple eyes. So I'm looking at this horseshoe crab and I'm like, yo, why do they have compound eyes? I thought compound eyes was a more evolutionarily derived feature because, you know, having a bunch of little eyes basically compressed into a giant eye, you know, I thought that was just something that had to be evolved. Like, you started out simple and you got to more complex. Now, as I got older, I found out that that's not the case. It's actually backwards. Compound eyes are actually the ancestral condition to a lot of arthropod eyes. So it actually started out that way. So if you look at trilobites, one of the classic ancestral arthropods, probably the granddaddy arthropod that gave rise to every other single arthropod that we know that is extant today, they had compound eyes. Horseshoe crabs and other Xiphosurians go back about 450 million years. That's a long time in the deep past, you know. So horseshoe crabs and Xiphosurians have maintained their compound eyes from their compound-eyed ancestors, whereas modern-day arachnids have actually reduced the compound eye into simple eyes. But what I also learned about horseshoe crabs that is pretty crazy is that not only do they have these two lateral compound eyes, is that they also have a series of simple eyes spread throughout the body. And one of the most notable simple eyes is right here in the front. You see that you have these 1, 2, 3 simple eyes there. And this is basically a, you know, an aggregation of photoreceptive cells that probably sense certain wavelengths of light that these compound eyes here on the sides don't sense. I do know that horseshoe crabs, based on their photoreceptors, will sense certain wavelengths of light, which will actually stimulate whether they start to mate or not, or whether it's time to mate, essentially. And apparently there are some eyes on the Telson as well. And also on the ventral side, there is a photoreceptive section here too. So this organism, as well as probably its ancestors, had the ability to sense different wavelengths of light for different physiological purposes or biological purposes. So this particular species, Limulus polyphemus, lives in brackish estuarine environments. So an estuarine environment is where you get a decent mixture of salt and fresh water kind of mixing in the same area and everything. And these are basically patrolling the flat, barren sand bottoms or sand mud bottoms within those areas, and they're basically acting like little vacuum cleaners, kind of patrolling the bottoms of the sand, digging within the sand and sifting up little organisms, whether it be dead, alive, you know, scavenging or eating, you know, certain invertebrates within that sandy matrix. They're also migratory, and the reason they're migratory is for mating. So males and females will link up and they'll actually crawl up out of the water onto a sandy beach where they can deposit their eggs into the sandy soil, kind of like how grunion do it, except in an arthropod kind of way, which, you know, would protect it from any, you know, marine dwelling predator that might eat those eggs. You know, those eggs will still be eaten by a lot of birds, and actually horseshoe crabs account for a huge portion of the diet of a lot of seabirds out in the East Coast and everything. So ecologically, these species are very important in starting off the food web out there on the East Coast sandy beaches. So I'm noticing right here along the margins, along the posterior margins of its carapace, you can see these hairs. Now, undoubtedly, these hairs are used as some sort of sensory mechanism, probably mechanoreception, you know, sensing pressure waves in the water and everything. So what these things will do is, like, every season, they'll actually make their way out of the water, you know, coming up on the sandy beaches to mate. So you'll have a male and a female, and we'll get into whether this is a male and a female in a bit. And, you know, they'll basically do their little amplexus thing. The males will hook up with the females, they'll go onto the beaches, out there in the East Coast, and they'll start laying their eggs in the sand and everything, and then the eggs in the sand will incubate, and you know, tidal regimes will come through, stimulate those eggs to hatch, and then you get the following generation. All right, so now let's flip it over to the ventral side, and here's the more interesting side right here. All right, so again, it's an arthropod, so it's got a nice, you know, hard exoskeleton, chitinized exoskeleton. Chitin is basically just a sugar molecule that's been reinforced with nitrogen to give it a little bit more plasticity and everything. But again, notice right here you got the prosoma, the front section, the epithysoma, the rear section. The prosoma has all these walking legs coming out of it. You can see this first set of appendages right here. These are the chelicerae, or the mouth parts, and you can notice that they're chelate or pincer shaped, which obviously aids in helping manipulate food and everything. Just posterior to that is the mouth section, which is in here, so it will actually grab and rip, again, eviscerate and mince pieces of food and bring it down to this section right here. And you notice these backwards facing spines. Well, as it's moving its legs, it can actually direct that food into its mouth, which is way up in there. Now, this particular individual right here is a female, and the reason I know that it's a female is because this second set of appendages right here, these are actually not really considered walking legs. These are actually pedipalps, right? And spiders and scorpions have pedipalps as well. Pedipalps within arachnids and other chelicerates are used for many different functions based on the biology of that particular species. Within this species, it seems that the pedipalps here are actually just used for walking legs. There's like an extra set of walking legs. And males of this species, the pedipalps don't actually look like this. They actually look more mitten shape or boxing glove shape, and the reason they're shaped that way is so they can grab onto the posterior portion of the epithysoma of the female when it's in the mating process. This pair right here would basically be almost homologous to what a scorpion's pincers would be, or a spider's pedipalp, but I guess in this case they're actually used as walking legs. So unlike many arachnids which have 8 legs, horseshoe crabs appear to have 10 legs, or 5 pairs of legs. See, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And you notice right here, the most posterior leg, it has these certain protrusions or appendages coming off of it. And these are basically used as paddles. So these are what's known as the pushing legs. So as it's walking along that mud bottom, it'll actually use these as paddles, stick it in the sand, which gives it more surface area to kick off of. So this is the main leg that's used in basically propelling it through that sandy bottom, on the surface of that sandy bottom in its estuarine environment. And another feature that Xiphosurians have that arachnids have are these right here. Now within Xiphosurians, these are called book gills, whereas in arachnids they're called book lungs, because they sit in the abdomen like sets of pages in a book. Now this is where all the gas exchange occurs. This is how it gets its oxygen. So within the folds of these gills here is where the diffusion of oxygen into the body of this organism occurs, and the excretion of carbon dioxide into the external environment occurs. You see right here becomes even more lamellar. That's kind of the scientific term for like leaf shape or page shape, these lamellae right here. So this is where a lot of the gas exchange would occur. Now, modern day arachnids have a very similar structure to this. However, it's not exposed to the outside environment like this. Rather, it is enclosed. Instead of having book gills, they're what's known as book lungs. So if you ever look underneath the skirt of a spider and you see these little slits underneath the ventral portion of its prosoma, within those slits you'll have structures very similar to this. And the reason they're internal is because when you're inside something, you can hold on to the humidity in there, just like our lungs. Like if our lungs were dry, we wouldn't be able to extract oxygen from the air. Oxygen has to diffuse through a moist environment, something that's wet. Now these things live in an aquatic environment, so their book gills are constantly moist. But if you think of a spider or a scorpion, which is actually, you know, terrestrial, they have to have their book lungs enclosed by the external exoskeleton, which basically holds and keeps a moist environment inside. Xiphosurians, with their stubborn phenotypes, they've been around for hundreds of millions of years, so they're more likely to exhibit those early primitive characteristics of primitive arthropods. And I know you're wondering, because everybody wonders, right here, this is the anus. Right? So as they're eating, they'll actually, so yeah, they're kind of halfway scavengers, halfway predators. So they'll be Again, I mentioned earlier, they'll be scurrying along the mud bottoms and you kind of like probing and digging in the sand, kind of searching for any organism that might be there that would be a worthy food source. And they'll actually uptake the sand as well too, because their digestive system is very efficient to where when they eat the sand, they can actually digest any food particles that might be stuck within that sand. So as the food makes its way through the digestive tract, when it poops out everything, it'll actually poop out sand as well. And this Telson right here is obviously used as a balance mechanism. Sometimes when they're in the surf can get pretty turbulent and these things might get flipped over. And what they can do is they can actually take this Telson, dig it in the sand, and flip themselves back over. Yeah, I've always wanted to look at something like this up close. It's pretty badass in my opinion. Always wanted to see this. For the external anatomy on a scorpion, they have a Telson too, but the Telson is actually inclusive of most of the opithosoma, or the abdomen section of the arachnid. This Telson, on the other hand, is an extension from the most terminal section of the abdomen. So basically, I'm saying it's the terminal section because the anus is right here, and this basically juts out from the anus. If you look at the Telson on a scorpion, the anus is way at the end of the stinger section, or just right before the stinger. And it's obviously used for different purposes. However, you know, I wouldn't be surprised if a scorpion's Telson had derived from a similar structure. I know, man, I just think it's crazy just, you know, looking at such a you know, a prehistoric morphology, you know, a very stubborn phenotype, a stubborn external morphological phenotype that has been present, you know, on this planet for well over 400 million years, almost relatively unchanged. And it's just kind of exciting to know that, you know, this type of, you know, quote, primitive body style, this primitive morphology is still advantageous for this species today. Although there are many disadvantages that this species has, particularly within the Anthropocene, living amongst humans and everything, you know, with the advent of humans becoming more dominant on this planet and obviously being more responsible for releasing more pollution into the environment, changing up the aquatic chemistry, with changing up different things of the environment that things might be used to. These are basically now considered vulnerable or almost endangered. You know, they're monitoring population numbers and they're continuing to see those population numbers fall. However, on another side of things, I've learned that horseshoe crabs, Xiphosurians, are actually used to test out new, you know, medicinal drugs and anything that's used in the medicinal field. You know, any new drug that's been developed, any new vaccine or anything that's being used to market to the medical industry has to go through horseshoe crab blood testing. So horseshoe crabs are highly resistant to disease and a lot of different environmental changes, which is probably the reason why they've been able to exist for so long on this planet, because they're so resistant to certain environmental changes and everything. Based on the lovely, proud scientists that are doing the research out there on the East Coast, they are noticing that these numbers are still falling and everything. And that obviously is probably due to the presence of humans, just simply to the presence of humans, changing up the water chemistry with all these aquatic pollutants and, you know, terrestrial pollutants that make it into the aquatic ecosystem, you know, certain light pollution, all sorts of pollution. It's just kind of just messing things up for everything, not just horseshoe crabs, but these horseshoe crabs are a definite indicator of the change of ecology within that certain region. But yeah, Limulus polyphemus, the Atlantic horseshoe crab. Thank you for the good people at Bio Corporation for sending me such a large specimen. I'm gonna just let this dry out and then it'll be kind of preserved in this static state, and then I'll hopefully be able to use it for future presentations that I might give. But yeah, it's a badass creature, man. It's just, you know, I don't know, again, this is like one of the type of things that float my boat, just kind of looking at certain things like this. I mean, this is just this is pretty sick to me. I mean, this is just kind of like cool, just kind of looking at something that is considered so primitive, you know, but it's still basically living today, functioning ecologically today. It'd be crazy. I wonder if these prehistorically were ever out here on the West Coast. As far as I know, these are only on the East Coast. There are different species of these throughout the world, some in Asia, a lot within the Atlantic, and I think within the Indian Ocean. But yeah, this is nuts. Limulus polyphemus, the Atlantic horseshoe crab. What people call a living fossil. Go and learn some.